Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Drew Mitnick, and I am the Digital Policy Program Director at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. We're here today for an event titled Disrupted Alliance, What the Rise of the U.S. Tech Right Means for the Future of the Transatlantic Relationship. This event is co-hosted by the Heinrich Böll Foundation and Public Citizen. We have four fantastic panelists who I will introduce shortly, but just to set a little bit of framing for the conversation. The purpose of the event today is to discuss how the tech right in the US has impacted the transatlantic relationship between the US and EU, with a focus on digital and trade policies, but I think we'll also be talking about human rights, given that we have quite a significant background in those issues, along with the broader challenges to democracy. It's not a surprise, I think, to say that the Trump administration has targeted the EU on digital policies as a source of tension between the US and EU. I think maybe what has come in as a surprise is the forcefulness with which it has come and the extent to which it has been a foundational challenge to the transatlantic relationship. Specifically, the Trump administration has targeted new AI rules. They've also targeted rules on platforms and on markets. These are regulations that are intended to promote human rights and fair markets online. In an official memo, the president has aligned himself with tech leaders who have said that the EU's digital regulations are a threat to U.S. business. J.D. Vance went to Paris a few months ago, and what might be the most forceful speech on the US-EU relationship, in which he called for the EU to deregulate on tech. He called for Europe to buy American goods, and it was a speech that I think upended the idea of a US-European partnership and really put Europe as a secondary to the US. And this is not just a matter of rhetoric. Tomorrow is what is being termed Liberation Day, which might, in some parts of Europe, have significant meaning as a term, but what is intended is to be the day where the U.S. will target Europe with what are clearly going to be significant tariffs. It could lead to rises in prices in the U.S. and EU. Meanwhile, the European Commission is expected to announce fines on Meta and Apple for under the Digital Markets Act, which is the law that is supposed to regulate fair markets. And there's going to be a lot of attention on what those fines are going to look like, the expectation being that it'll be a sign of how aggressive the European Commission will be in enforcing its own digital laws. But this really is not just about regulation and trade. Of course, we had Elon Musk, who perhaps with the coming off of the victory of Trump in the U.S. presidential election, endorsed the far-right party in Germany. DOGE has made significant cuts to the U.S. federal government, some of which implicate the U.S. and European relationship. The Federal Trade Commission, the two Democratic commissioners have been fired, which could impact the U.S.-EU relationship on tech. And of course, there's the threat of the U.S. withdrawing from multilateral institutions, which would leave Europe on an island when it comes to things like supporting democracy. And so with that context, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Starting at the far side for me, Jan-Philipp Albrechts is the co-president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation based in Berlin. He previously served as the Minister of Energy, Agriculture, Environment, Nature, and Digitalization in the German state of Schleswig-Holstein, and previously was a member of the European Parliament for 9 years, where he introduced the General Data Protection Regulations. He also led negotiations for that law. So you have a background in digital regulation. Rebecca Williams is a writer, lawyer, and artist whose work investigates how data and technology affect power. She is currently the senior strategist for the Privacy and Data Governance Unit at the American Civil Liberties Union and serves on the board of Muckrock. Anna Lenhart is a policy fellow at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at the George Washington University. She previously served as a senior advisor at the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy and was a tech policy aide in the U.S. House of Representatives. And Rishabh Bailey is the research director for the Digital Trade Alliance. He was also an advocate on tech policy in India and focused on issues concerning telecommunications regulation, protection of digital rights, platform regulation, and data governance. With that very impressive list of backgrounds for our panelists, Jan, I would like to start with you. You've seen the reaction to this new aggressiveness from the U.S. side on Europe, and it would be nice maybe to get a background on what the reaction looks like in Europe, but then also I'm wondering, is the reaction that you're seeing from the institutions, places like the European Commission, or what we can expect, how they'll react? Is that the same in the way that we're seeing kind of like maybe the general reaction to what DOGE and Trump are doing on digital policies?
Thank you very much, Drew, also for setting up today's event, which I think comes at the right time. Also, as we are here, get us the opportunity to meet up with these great colleagues. So I'm happy to get into discussion very soon. But answering to your question, I think that what pretexts this development of the last 3 months, of course, is a reaction from the Europeans on the way how these tech giants acted in their businesses, especially Elon Musk, changed dramatically the way how he uses or misuses the generally neutral platform ex-Twitter in political context and for political purposes, even for campaign purposes, which I would say people, also regulators in Europe, haven't really found an answer to, although the legal situation might be quite clearly stating that this is not in line with European law, of course, what he has done, in particular with regards to the fact that all these platforms are since decades privileged on liability and therefore have the duty to stay neutral, and it's not at all clear what their algorithms are preferencing and after which logics and indications this is happening. So there's a lot to be investigated, and there's a lot which Europeans had to look at and react to. But the first and foremost reaction was a more political reaction, as in the UK and Germany, for example, people left X massively towards Blue Sky or other services, and Elon Musk became some kind of the image of the oligarchs from the other side of the Atlantic, which needs to be some kind of divested from, defunded, whatever, and consumers are reacting to that. Of course, also there is more and more investigations, not only into the case of Elon Musk and X, but also when it comes to other tech giants on the market, on the European market. The European market is one which has been ramping up its possibilities to enforce fair competition on the European market, in particular on the European digital market. There's a lot of competition cases brought forward, and of course also new regulation on the block with the DMA in particular, enforcement measures still being worked on, which adds to the enforcement in the field of data protection and also disinformation, DSA, which is being brought forward by the Europeans. So that's happening, but on a very thorough basis, and that means processes take their time. These regulations are still quite new. Even the GDPR, if you think about this is now for 7 years in place, that's quite a time, but for procedures from that scale we're talking about, that's maybe not so long ago. And last but not least, the question is, what's the answer of the Europeans from the level of governments and the European Commission, apart from pure enforcement measures, or what's their activity vis-a-vis their own enforcement agencies? will it be reduced in the scope or speed of enforcing these standards towards US tech giants in particular? I would say that's an open question still. And I would also say, I mean, the reason why this new administration, which is partnering with these tech giants for the reasons of regime change in this country and in the world, is also reacting like this towards the Europeans, because it's the opposite side of the regime they want to change. Like, the Europeans are the value enemies of this administration. It's the ones who are very dangerous to their tool of the tech giants doing that on a global level. They have the biggest market in the world and a very strict enforcement regime further than any other country in the world. And so that's the reason why they react so harshly. And they do it in a way which is more than just talking about tech enforcement. I mean, already before the election of Donald Trump, I think J.D. Vance was pushing forward this quote that if the Europeans go forward with enforcing their rules vis-a-vis X, they might be suffering significant cuts of Ukraine aid from the US side. So this is putting it on the highest geopolitical level, even putting into question, as you said, the transatlantic partnership in substance. And the question if NATO has a future and whatever, all of that came up also in the context of these questions. And the Terrorist Liberation Day, of course, are playing in that direction too. And so it's still an open question how the Europeans will react. But I would say three things on that. First is, most of these laws we are talking about are already in place in the European Union. And the European Union is a very rule of law based creature. And they have a very strong court, which is not only asked if the political branch needs an answer, but they just answer what the law is and tell the politicians what to do. And also the enforcement agencies. So that is why it will be only a small range of possibility for the political leadership to act in diversion from the legal principles which has been put into practice already. So they can't just not enforce the GDPR or can't just not enforce the DSA or the DMA. They will be forced to enforce it in a certain way. And also because it's a federal system, there will be national agencies from various member states going forward, no matter what the Irish whatever agency is doing, or the whatever the European Commission wants to do, or the heads of states decide to do. So that's the first part of the answer. And then I think that in Europe at the moment, we are in a situation where the Europeans see that there is no real sense in giving in to this administration, because they realize now very clearly that this administration doesn't want to negotiate, but it just wants to rip them off. And they understood that. So they are not dealing with a negotiator, but with a bully trying to rip them off. So that's also how they will react to it, also towards the terrorists, by the way. They will try to be the adults on the schoolyard and get this bully somehow in line with the tools they have. And they have some tools to do it. And that's the second part of the answer. The third is, even if there would be political will to compromise on tech regulation further, we have a situation that in the European Parliament and also in the European Council, the Council of the European Union, and all of these bodies, which are the legislative bodies, it's been harder and harder now to get a yes vote for anything. So there won't be new regulation, like further implementing regulation. They already said goodbye to the e-privacy regulation and so on. I mean, there's things they take off the table because they know they won't get a majority anymore in their institutions for that, with the member states also agreeing to that. But in the same way, if you want to change the laws, you need a positive yes majority to change the laws. So you won't get a majority for that either. So that's making it very unlikely that the Europeans have any ability to go any other way than just holding the line and protecting their space and their market. And they have also a good reason to go down that line, as it becomes more obvious now with this geopolitical situation and the security situation that they have to look to protect their European community and the values connected with the European community, rather than trying to get into transactional one-by-one deals with this administration. They will rather concentrate on their common space. And that makes it, although the European Union is in a delicate moment and there is a lot of split-offs and there's Hungary and whatever, it plays in the cards of those who try to get unity done in Europe right now. So what Trump is actually achieving, and also these tech giants are achieving, that Europeans unite more than before on several questions, and it's an open game. And I would even say a gamble from this administration and the tech giants, which I would say are in a more delicate position than we might think. So the Europeans are stronger than they think, and this administration and the tech giants are in a more delicate position than they think, or than we think maybe too. But that's my assessment for the moment. I'm very happy to also listen to other opinions and observations, as this obviously is a time where there's it's a hard time to answer questions really in a very definitive way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm it's hearing the reaction in Europe is, of course, as you've identified, it's not an easy moment to do that because there's still so much to come. There's still so much to come, and there's more to learn. There's more there's competing interests from the European side. But I think it's worth hearing a little bit more about what's actually happening in the U.S. Rebecca, I know that you've been closely tracking what DOGE has been doing, but I think one thing that seems interesting is that we have this ideology, this cyber libertarianism that perhaps has influenced Silicon Valley traditionally, but now is playing a pretty central role in what we're seeing in the U.S. government, and maybe it's the central force for what is actually happening. And I think some of these questions are like, what does this mean for data? What does it mean for how U.S. government works? And so, what is your perspective that might be worth sharing for Europeans trying to understand the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that question, panel. So cyber libertarianism has been popularized by Professor David Glanvia, who had a book posthumously published by the same name. If you're interested in this panel, you're probably interested in that book. But broadly speaking, it takes cyber technology and libertarianism freedom, the idea that there's some inherent freeing quality to the use of technology. And we've seen that rhetoric in big tech for a long time. Like Facebook is, by nature of being online, democratizing a variety of things. And I think how it relates to what's happening with Doge and Elon Musk's role as previously a big tech actor, and now a pseudo president, a second president, is very much borrowing that language that has been popularized throughout big tech and a bit in the government as well, with the agency that it has adopted as its host, formerly known as USDS. And there's also legal authorities and things that we can get into. But just in terms of the rhetoric of that office was we're a startup within government. A lot of the rhetoric that helps technology companies not get regulated in the United States is we are giving you goodies, we're giving you connection, we're giving you, again, like more freedom. And I think to the extent, I mean, there's a lot of variables that folks in the room are very well aware of as to like why these organizations are not regulated or why they might have significant power right now, including Elon Musk's role in Doge. But to the extent that the rhetoric is like a popular one, to assume that technology might give you more freedom, it certainly it comes at a time when Americans and people around the world want more power. They want to feel empowered, and certainly the lawlessness of the internet might feel like a freeing place that you want to protect. But yeah, I don't. We can get more into the Doge stuff, but that's my. I want to make sure we get to everyone in the short time. But yeah, I think cyber libertarianism, the rhetoric is like pretty significant to what's happening, not just with big tech's alignment outside of the federal government, but Doge's entrenchment.
Sure. And Anna, moving to you, I know that you've been closely tracking some of the larger impacts of some of the digital regulations, the European digital regulations. So for example, the Digital Services Act, it has provisions on transparency and research that have global benefits. And I think the question right now is, are we going to realize some of those benefits as there's this attack on those digital regulations? What do you see changing now as there's this US pressure on Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to build off my colleague's discussion of rhetoric because I think it's super important. The discussion in DC right now around the Digital Services Act is not reasoned. It is not in good faith, right? It is for a couple key purposes in this moment. The first is that the Trump administration and therefore the Republican Party has managed to capture this narrative that we are the party of free expression. They've managed to capture that while silencing researchers, silencing student activists, silencing journalists, silencing bureaucrats, silencing artists. They've managed to do all of that and hold on deeply to this narrative. And the way they're doing it is by saying and telling platforms that they should have to keep everything that's posted on there, whether it's bad information, whether it's hateful, that they should have to keep it. And so, of course, it's the Digital Services Act is like a great thing to throw negative energy on because they can say that this law is censoring. And the other thing I'll circle back to is X, right? And I think it's really clear, and we really have to say it out loud, like X at this moment is essentially state media. Now that could change, but in this moment, that's what it is. And so what that means is if you are a Republican sitting in the Senate, there's a lot of things you're worried about in this moment. You're worried about Elon's money being used against you in a primary. Right now, Elon is trying to buy a race in Wisconsin as we speak. But you are also worried about his next tweet and what it could mean, not just for your career, but potentially for your family. We know that these platforms can lead to real physical harms. So it's important to kind of put that in the context of why going after the DSA is important to this administration in this movement. And then I'm going to talk about two ways that they're doing this. These are a little wonky, but I think important. So the first is they're dropping illegal in front of illegal content. And so if you look at the letters from the House Judiciary Committee to the European Commission, you'll see they make statements like the Digital Services Act requires the removal of content, period. And you look at the citation, and it's actually a link or, references the illegal content provisions of the Digital Services Act. So why are they doing that? Well, first, because illegal content has meaning in the United States. The United States recognizes certain types of illegal content. That's not a new concept to us. Additionally, EU member states have long had varying illegal content laws on the books. Little startup Google, little startup Facebook had to navigate all of those illegal content laws, and they did so. This is not new, but they don't want to make it sound like the Digital Services Act is built on work and laws before. They want to make it sound super new and scary. It's important to watch what they're doing there. The other thing, getting to researcher access, is that they're going after the systemic risk mitigations, right? So this idea that the large platforms are going to have to mitigate systemic risks against the European Union. And they're essentially saying that those mitigation tactics are going to lead to censorship here in the US. And it's important to call that what that is. And it's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. And the truth of the matter is, if platforms are reducing their systemic risks, it's going to impact the entire information environment. That's true. We don't know what that impact is going to be, though. It could be small, it could be big, it could be good, it could be bad in some effects. We don't know. And that is why the research access provisions are so important, not just for making sure that the DSA works for Europe. I think the research access provisions are important there, but to truly understand the impact of that law and risk mitigation techniques that platforms can use on the whole world. And so, the Trade and Technology Council under the Biden administration was having a lot of really important discussions about how do we make those researcher access provisions really global so that we can work at a global level on getting really good quality understanding of our information environment. And obviously, I don't assume that those conversations are going to continue at the White House level, but what I will say is I think they can still continue. One thing I've really taken away working on researcher access provisions is one, they need to be truly global, not just EU and US. Really, if you're talking about having data subjects from around the world in these data sets, you need to have stakeholders from around the world in these conversations. And big international conversations take a long time. So even if the White House is stepping back from international venues in this moment, I still absolutely think civil society, academics, various stakeholders from around the world should try to continue conversations to whatever impact they can.
Great. And Rishab, we've been talking a lot about how the digital policies are being conflated with issues of trade. And I think for a lot of us who focus on digital policy, we're not as versed in the trade side of the debate. And so this confusion kind of poses a challenge for those of us trying to track the debate. You've been tracking the trade side of it, and it's as we mentioned, it's an opportune time, in addition to tomorrow being Liberation Day, when the Trump administration is intending to impose significant tariffs on Europe and elsewhere. There was also a U.S. Trade Representative report yesterday on trade barriers. So there's a lot to dig into that can be a challenge. What are your initial impressions of the moment from the trade side of it? And again, what is maybe your message for Europe when it comes to these issues?
Thanks for the question and thanks for organizing the panel. So yes, as you mentioned, the US TR released a report yesterday called National Trade Estimates Report, which is an annual report released by the USTR. It's statutorily required to do so, which identifies non-tariff trade barriers around the world. So these are basically a list of laws that the US is coming after, if you will. Now, historically, the NTE report has been critiqued by civil society and consumer groups because it's basically a laundry list of every sort of public interest regulation that corporates in America don't like. So it's, clean food, access to medicines, and of course, digital. However, what happened under the Biden administration was somewhat unusual. There was a slight departure from the previous, in that the report specifically recognized the right of countries to regulate in public interest. It specifically recognized the sovereign right of countries to regulate their economies and societies. So just as an example, last year's report did away with references to a host of data protection laws, which are coming up around the world. It also did away with references to pro-competition or digital competition-related laws, including in the EU. We've seen DMA, and we know now a lot of countries are looking into adopting similar competition regulation. I mean, look at Korea, India, Brazil, so on and so forth. Of course, there was outrage about this change in position and a lot of lobbying over the past year. And as is pointed out previously, this administration is particularly close to big tech companies or anyway. So therefore, yesterday's report is a bit of a reversion to the mean. It goes back to listing every sort of law that could possibly affect an American company in any way. So it includes, as I mentioned, a whole host of these competition-related laws in a number of countries, including jurisdictions, including the EU. Again, the broad argument here is that these laws impose one-sided obligations on American companies or target American companies. And in this context, I actually agree with something that Jean-Philippe said, that I don't think it's particularly useful to position this sort of fines on Apple and Meta as being retaliation or revenge. As mentioned, these are laws that have been on the books for a long time, and they go through court processes. And these are actions based on a neutral law, which could target any company. It just so happens American companies dominate the digital ecosystem. Similarly, the report targets a whole host of DSTs, or digital services taxes, which has become a really important issue because multilateral negotiations on how to tax the digital economy are really going nowhere at this point in time. Again, to some extent due to the US government's position on this. It targets a whole host of data protection, cybersecurity, and other laws that restrict cross-border data transfers, even if they're only a very specific or particularly sensitive data set. So, for example, health data and so on. It also, in the context of the EU, specifically mentions the DSA, which you've spoken about, and the AI Act, which is seen as imposing onerous and non-standard obligations on American companies, and also possibly exposing American companies' IP to misuse because of its transparency requirements. So you see this sort of clash between proprietary interests of American companies and transparency norms, or social interests in this case. Equally, it also mentions the Data Act, which requires sharing of non-personal data in the EU, and also interestingly, requires companies who have access to non-personal data to prevent other governments getting access to that data, which I think will be a problem for American companies in particular. Now, all these identified barriers sort of tie in with the second report, which is expected tomorrow, as you mentioned, on Liberation Day, which will again sort of go through this exercise of once again identifying trade barriers. I presume the reports will be largely identical insofar as that is concerned. However, the additional feature of tomorrow's report that it will add these retaliatory measures expected to be tariffs. The indications, or at least what news reports seem to indicate, is that there'll be sort of flat double-digit target tariffs on EU imports in the US, not only because of its digital policies, but these will no doubt be a feature. Just a quick thing on tariffs, though. I mean, like, we've seen this word increasingly thrown around. I mean, people don't really speak about this, or hadn't spoken about this, 3-4 months ago. I mean, trade has suddenly become the cool thing to talk about now. But tariffs are just one sort of tool in a toolbox that a government has to deal with whatever, international and domestic issues it has. Typically, also, I would say that while tariffs can be a really useful tool in a lot of cases, they need to be supported by other domestic measures, such as investments into research and development or capacity building and manufacturing, and they need to be targeted. Imposing sort of these arbitrary, unilateral and universal tariffs ultimately are going to hurt, businesses, consumers, and of course, relationships with countries, including those that have been close allies for many, many decades.
We'll do another couple questions, but would also encourage the folks on the live stream to submit questions as well. So I think one question that I have in this moment is, we have the Digital Markets Act, which is supposed to regulate fairness in markets. And in theory, you have elements of the Trump administration that has historically supported antitrust enforcement, and perhaps going specifically after big tech. And there might be cultural reasons for that. But I think the question is, why is the Digital Markets Act also a target for the Trump administration, rather than being a point of potential collaboration in trying to bring access to the little tech agenda that has been part of the coalition of tech leaders that have supported the Trump administration? I mean, Anna, maybe I'll start with you, but would encourage other folks who have knowledge of the Digital Markets Act or perspective as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I mean that the only thing I can come up with is just because it's Europe, and you can tie Europe to socialism and then attack it. That's just a very simple rhetoric thing. So I won't try to speculate much more than that in terms of why they're going after the Digital Markets Act. What I will talk a little bit about is the cases. So we have some major antitrust cases in the United States right now. And the way they're structured is that, so there's Google, there's Facebook, there's Amazon, and the way they're structured is they have a federal lead, so either the FTC or the DOJ, and then they're supported by state attorney general's offices. And so in terms of will those cases move forward, I think they will. One, because many were started under the Trump administration. They have kind of verbal support from JD Vance and other people in the movement. But also because the state attorneys generals want them to continue to move forward. I think what antitrust people are kind of looking at in the United States is the staffing challenges at DOJ and FTC, as we see things like 2 commissioners getting kicked off of the FTC. What is that going to do to staff morale? Are we going to see cuts in staff? Because state attorneys generals, while they want those cases to move forward, do not have the same amount of capacity. So if DOJ and FTC either back down or back off, you could see those cases slowed and maybe some challenges there. Where I think the Digital Markets Act is really helpful, and I would say to my European colleagues, is a lot of analysts are trying to figure out what the remedies will be in these cases. And that is where the Digital Markets Act is really helpful to try to figure out what changes can these companies make that have really great impacts for small businesses and consumers. I think the one big concern I have is that, we put years of work into these cases and that the remedies just be really, really weak. And then what I think you'll see happen is similar to what you have as a backlash among the public to things like GDPR, where they're like, oh, it just led to pop-ups. It just led to an annoying cheap choice screen, right? I really want to avoid that. And so, I think the team that's working on Digital Markets Act has done a great job getting out some really handy reports. I think in continuing to encourage scholars to be able to use those data access measures so that we can really see the impact of the DMA is going to be very, very important right now.
Great. And
You can only chime in.
oh, sure.
Hi, Johannes. Apologies for being late. Johannes Barker, EU delegations, just because you said if someone has knowledge about the Digital Markets Act.
Yeah.
So we have had some conversations with the colleagues in the administration, obviously. And there are indeed, like, on substance similarities with what we are doing and what the cases are doing. And there are decisions upcoming actually under the DMA imminently. And we had some last week. But they also clearly say there's a big difference whether you guys do it, but our companies only do it.
Right.
So it's as blunt and as simple as that. And so it's not recognized that in another jurisdiction, you regulate the market according to the market, not according to the companies where they're from. And on the DSA topic, which Anna touched upon already quite intensively, I spent a lot of time explaining the DSA provisions and explaining the safeguards that are, let's say, built in, especially the means to seek redress and the statement of reasons, which are public in a database. You have like 10.5 billion online. Everybody can search them. And so quite often, if I speak to Jordan's people also, they actually, they know certain things. Article 34, 35, they know it by heart. And then other things they simply ignore. And then if you have a conversation behind closed doors, they acknowledge that okay, there was maybe a gap and they look into this, but of course they come from a very, they come from a ideologically driven standpoint, and it's very difficult to be pedagogic there. But it's what they run about.
Can I just add on?
Yeah, of course, please.
Just to take off from there, I think it's very clear that the US also regards its big tech companies as strategic assets to some extent.
Yeah.
And that's something important to take into consideration. They don't want other countries to be touching them, particularly putting in place regulations or any kind of enforcement measures that would actually rock the boat and do things to these companies that the US can't really see happening. Structural separation, all these kind of issues that are not really talked about.
But you have these kind of little tech advocates like Vance and others, right? And what the DMA, for example, does is breaking up the ecosystem for American companies as well to compete on the European market against the big American companies.
Absolutely.
So
No, I completely agree. No, in fact, I'm an advocate of that. Yeah.
I think that's my challenge.
I think, yeah.
Europeans. They keep wanting this Republican Party to come from a place of reasons. I think it's important to recognize that the Republican Party is quickly becoming persona government, oriented around an individual who just cares about power. And you might have one-on-one conversations that seem reasonable, but that's not where the shift is happening. I think that's just really important.
And the final sort of quick point was, I think, why the EU in particular. One, if you can bully your friend, you can bully anyone. So it's a lesson, I suppose. Second is, I think there is some element of worry about the Brussels effect, and the fact that we've seen, say, with the GDPR, a number of jurisdictions in Africa and Asia that have used the GDPR as a base for their own domestic data protection laws. You now have a whole host of countries trying to come up with digital competition laws, where again they're going to use or look at the DMA certainly as an example or a starting point, and that becomes problematic then if you have companies having to comply with these directions or enforcement actions in multiple jurisdictions, and again with the possibility of huge fines and so on.
I think at that point, really interesting to go back to the ideological origin of this development. Thinking about these tech companies in the Silicon Valley, for them, it was liberating to evade regulation, of course. This is a liberating moment. It was the internet was like the free opportunity of developing things without being regulated, you know? And we also created a framework for that where a lot of regulation on intellectual property or other things was not fully applying in that sphere where we, again, worked with privileges for these platforms and services in a large extent, because we even treated a service platform like Eggs like it would be some kind of a network company sending data from A to B without doing anything on it and so on. It was a time, even the Commission for, I would say, almost 2 decades refrained from getting into enforcement on these companies for a long time. But then the moment changed, and yes, I think the Europeans somehow, from their view, opened the box of the Pandora, which is the extraterritorial application of their legislation on the internet, on the digital market, by saying these laws apply wherever you are. You don't need to be in Europe for that. If you do business here with our consumers, our laws apply, you know? And as you said, this makes an example to others in the world. And that's exactly where they react on. I mean, Elon Musk wants to go to Mars because it's extrajudicial. He wants to evade any jurisdiction. You know, so if I asked myself why he didn't build a platform already outside of the 12-mile zone for his company. You know, I mean, that's exactly what he wants to do. And the deal between the administration and these tech giants is that the tech giants make Trump and his team work, and Trump and his team is doing whatever they can do to get them free from any regulation of the others out there. And by the way, also inside. I mean, the president or director of the FCC is an example for that. You know, I mean, it's stepping back from any of that. And because you asked for like the Digital Markets Act, in the end, from the European side, this is like, okay, but like, we were together on that fair market, you know, fair competition. I mean, where are we? As you say, I mean, this is just, but you're completely right. It's not logical anymore. We're not talking about these logics anymore, but this is not something new. They know it, but they attack it, as Anna said, from an ideological point and with complete different framing, because they just want to get rid of anyone regulating them, except their body Trump, which won't regulate him, you know, so.
We have a comment in the room.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre, from the Swiss Embassy. I've been here for 4 years, and it's funny to see how the Republicans shifted from being completely anti big platforms. We went through the deplatforming of everyone, and now they're kind of, you know, trying to defend these big social medias. I wonder, in this tumultuous time, I always do some mental exercise and mental gymnastic to see where can we work together, because it's just, you know, these days we have to pay more attention on that. And I wonder what could be the common points of this administration agenda and the framework that we have in Europe, in the sense that maybe in terms of messaging, there are some very good things in these regulations, and it's just we've not been able to frame it in a way that appeals to this cyber libertarian, or I was thinking, you know, if DSA or DMA was there in this country 5-6 years ago, if we could have like deplatform a former president, or if you could have do these things, there surely must be some common points where we can frame this a little bit, take the heat off a little bit, and then wait for, you know, wait for the common points to sink in instead of going head to head. Because the way I see it, and it's a bit worrying also, particularly for Switzerland in the middle of Europe, in between different jurisdictions, is that we don't have the tech infrastructure and the tech powerhouses that the US has. And we're also very concerned with our data. We are very concerned with every regulation that comes, because we have to be equivalent to everyone. Also Asia, having mentioned also global perspective. How can we frame that in a way that to be provocative, that doesn't trigger the administration. And get out of the ideological, because one thing that has not been mentioned yet and is always mentioned in Washington is the rise of authoritarianism and the tech approach of China, the tech approach of Russia and the others. And there, I think there is a message where we can work together.
Let me just add, we had a couple comments from the online viewers. So I think one of the questions is about like this idea of how do we have neutral tech policy, specifically on AI was the question, when you have the people influencing tech policy endorsing far right candidates. That's one question. But then we also had a question on specifically this idea of US countering Chinese technology and what the rise of the tech right in the US government means for that. So if any of our panelists would like to respond to this.
Yeah, I don't have like a very technocratic policy answer to you here, and I appreciate that you're from Switzerland. But I do want to respond with a thought about commonality. I agree with Anna that the ideological bent of our leadership right now, Trump and co, is very mob mentality. And I think that's also why you don't want standards of regulation. The mob boss is the law. There is no other law. And actually the Digital Markets Act, if the Trump and co administration was not going after that, would be surprising, because they're going after anything that looks like a previous iteration of like a common ground rule of law. So I think it's not a straightforward answer to you, but if I wanted to partner with the mob boss, it would be a common enemy, which I don't like the idea of whatsoever, but that would be the common ground, because I think that is where much of our leadership has found partnership right now.
And I just want to run it home. I'd really run it home, because I really respect a lot of my European colleagues, and I think it's been a struggle to get this shift to be fully understood. I spent 3 years in Congress working on bipartisan privacy bills, bipartisan antitrust bills, and some even bipartisan transparency bills. The Republicans I worked with, some have been primaried out, they're no longer in Congress. Some are still there. And up until a few months ago, they believed that Putin invaded Ukraine, and now are silent. This is not a Republican Party who was centered around some values that we used to understand and used to be able to come and negotiate with. They are now operating at the whim of a man, one person who can change his mind. And so right now, I think, yeah, maybe there's some shared agreement about concerns over China. But tomorrow, Trump could decide, yeah, no, we're friends with them now. I called Putin. Putin said they're cool. And right now, I'm afraid my former colleagues in the Republican Party sitting in Congress right now would just be like, yeah, okay. I didn't think that 3 months ago, but yes, that's what's happening now, right? Like, I cannot emphasize this enough to my European friends. Like, what is happening in that quote unquote party right now is incredibly concerning. It is moving towards a persona of government. And so I would be very careful. I respect wanting to find common ground. I think that's a great idea. And I think trying to find common ground with a vast majority of the people in the United States, including people who check the box next to that administration for economic reasons and various other reasons, is very smart. Right? I think it's a good time to listen to a range of views and find a path forward. But to be very careful and recognize that the whims of one person are controlling a lot right now.
Just very quickly on the China point, I mean, I think what, say, the DeepSeek incident has shown us is that technology diffusion is incredibly difficult to police. Despite whatever export controls, this, that, and the other you put in place, it's only a matter of time. So I think what the differentiator actually will be when it comes to the adoption of these technologies is the sort of ethical and moral sort of layers built into the technology and the governance frameworks around that technology. And that is something I think that the EU in particular can look to focus on and sort of find commonalities in a sense with the US when it comes to
I absolutely agree, and that goes in the direction of like tech development with like a value base or not. I mean, it's very unclear what's the value base of the future we are heading to. Also because it's not really an ideological fight basically it's a power fight between those who try to limit power and those who try to centralize power. And that's actually the angle of discussion, you know. I mean, those who try to centralize power now just say, okay, yeah, we do that, we have to do that, because those who try to limit and balance power are not able to solve the problems anymore and to get the things done, you know. So that's the answer of Trump and Xi, and somewhere between and somewhere are those who are still sticking to limit the power, which was an essential base of this country too. And we have to see how long that still holds. But that's the power fight. And this power fight, of course, and this value fight takes place in technology right now, massively. And the problem is that those who try to limit power won't be able to do that in technology as long as they don't have transparency, they don't have a set of certain rules which apply, etc. And there we come to the common ground. I think that there is space for discussing what is actually the value base with at least those who you worked with, you know. I mean, it's fair for some Republicans to ask what's actually freedom of expression and all this about. I mean, I even could ask that question. I mean, why in the US it's not allowed to show naked pictures of persons? Why in Germany it's not allowed to show the swastika? I mean, you can put those problems on the table and discuss it, you know, and have a common sphere of value debate on that. And I would absolutely be in favor of sitting together with those people discussing it, you know, because we shouldn't fade away from that. It's serious issues we should talk about. But that's people who are interested in really talking, discussing, and finding a solution. But that's not the modus operandi of this administration at all. This is just showing strengths and therefore assuring power.
And one of the solutions that has been proposed to this conflict has been for Europe to develop tech sovereignty. It's an effort that has happened, you know, historically over the past couple of decades, maybe in a couple different ways. But now there's a new motivation for pushing for a Eurostack, a technology that's able to be built on European values that removes the US power from the equation. But I think there's this outstanding question of how feasible that would be. And if it happens, what that means for the EU-US relationship. I mean, does anyone want to respond to this as one of the current proposed options?
And can I add just one quick? Sure. Ireland has this Ministry of the Diaspora. If we look at all the brains from Europe that end up in the Silicon Valley and everything, this could also be, to your point of tech sovereignty, bring these people back home. We see that with academics, but I mean, just the salary differences are so big. And we need to be honest with ourselves. It's gonna come at a cost, but it's probably something we want to do. And I would just kind of include Switzerland in it. I know it's complicated sometimes, but
That's where the money is. So.
not for the money, for the brains and also for the research and everything. But we hear a lot of voices on the platform of European that are looking to go back home. But 5x, if you work in the Valley, then you can fly business 5 times a year back to Germany or to France.
But if you're worried about being detained, that 5x.
Yeah, I don't think they are.
See.
But tech sovereignty, yes.
I wonder, that's the market people should talk about, building the companies, but I feel like there's a bit more of an appetite for users, like tech users, to migrate to different platforms, like the X to Blue Sky exodus. Some folks coming off of like Instagram and Facebook, like after inauguration and some of the DEI stuff, like it's, as someone who's been like, please go to this this small app that you have to pay for a very long time. It's been encouraging to see that there is some appetite for that. So I think that is part of the equation, like with the flip side being like, what do you actually build as the alternative? But I think people are like very thirsty for alternatives. And they're very, to the failure of US antitrust law, upset that the core apps they use on the internet are all owned by the same person and look the same and have the same constraints and borders.
If I mean, just very quickly, one thing that I just sort of wanted to mention in the context of the previous thing is that freedom is something that a lot of big tech companies co-opted to serve their purposes. I don't think that that is what they are actually pushing. If we were pushing freedom, we would be pushing for interoperable, open ecosystems, which is to some extent what the sovereignty narrative also speaks to. One example of this, and because the sovereignty narrative is particularly it's caught on in the global majority countries, India and Brazil in particular have sort of led this data sovereignty, creating domestic stacks. India has like a well-known thing, which has its own problems, of course, state control, surveillance, all those kind of issues, exclusions, etc., etc. But the point is, digital public infrastructure as a global push is something that is being spoken about at the UN, at the G20, etc., etc. And the idea is broadly to create the ability or you create infrastructure which allows more and more companies to sort of port into the ecosystem and connect to each other, instead of having monolithic systems into which you are forced to sort of exist and you can't get out of. So I think that should be, again, an area of commonality, not just between the US and the EU, but looking at the EU and the rest of the world as well, because there's a lot of stuff happening in global South countries which really, really needs to be looked at. And I think, DPI is just one example of how the sovereignty narrative has been pushed. Also, I think it's important to consider that, what we've seen over the last couple of months, for instance, the sort of weaponization of Starlink and so on and so forth, the fact that the US government and DOGE has such ready access to data from any and every database that it wants to. These are serious, like strategic, military, and economic, social sort of problems. And it's only going to increase the sort of sovereignty narrative in this context. This should have happened 12 years back after Snowden. But maybe this is something that gives us that extra feeling.
Great. Does anyone have any other final input before we wrap this session? We're just at 10 o'clock right now.
I'll just quickly mention states because they haven't come up, and that is one area I absolutely think that Europeans should be thinking about. So states are the legislative branch that are going to pass new tech laws. They did last session and they will continue to, and they are starting to reference international standards. So Colorado's AI bill references an ISO standard for risk management framework. The European laws, the AI Act in particular, but also DMA and DSA have the potential to create new harmonized standards within Europe, but also to push ISO and potentially even the creation of standards bodies that have civil society on them and aren't just the companies. And if that's done and that's done well, then the states can reference those. And I'm going to have a paper I can send around to you that talks about this more, but I'm not trying to say like, hey, Europe, don't work with anyone here. I think there is some interesting stuff happening. I think I would just be very careful about what's happening in Washington right now.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I really think that there is a lot of potential. And I mean, this fuels into the national debate about like who will be common voices in opposition to this administration here. It will be most likely governors. And I really think that for the Europeans, that will be a very important effort, and they know that it worked in the first Trump administration, although it's a complete different version of it. We have already practiced that, especially when it comes to climate issues, and they can build on that.
So it sounds like things that we should be maybe paying attention to then to summarize the kind of the next steps looking forward. This look toward what European tech sovereignty could look like, and also perhaps some of the global partnerships that could be developed around it. And then also looking toward what the US states are going to be doing as the source of tech policy in the US in the lack of any option for federal policy. And so I want to say a thank you to our panelists for this what I thought was a really interesting discussion. I know we had mention of some papers that have been written recently, and so we can send those around and collect some papers and send those around to our guests. And with that, I will say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you so much for attending.